Alright, welcome back to part 2 of the Flat Earth documentary, The Globe is Dead.
Okay, so during the fake moon missions, which were nothing more than cheap B films produced by NASA, a branch of the US military, there's some really obvious proof that people have never gone to the moon, which isn't often spoken of. One of the major points I'd like to unpack a bit regarding the fakery afoot with the Apollo missions is the fact that the moon has essentially no atmosphere. Now, at sea level on Earth, we breathe in atmosphere, which each cubic centimeter contains 10 quintillion, or 10 followed by 18 zeros, molecules. So again, that's in a cubic centimeter, 10 quintillion molecules on Earth. Now, according to NASA, on the lunar atmosphere is claimed to contain less than 1 million molecules in the same volume. So the atmosphere on the moon would be considered actually a very good vacuum in Earth terms. Now, as a side note, although Freemasonic astronauts allegedly visited the moon with a variety of equipment intended to study the alleged geological and atmospheric makeup of the moon, it was only recently that NASA claims to have found evidence that the moon has an extremely sparse, or not that great atmosphere, containing some unusual gases, including sodium and potassium, which are not found in the atmosphere of Earth. Now, I'm obviously not agreeing with their claim, but I find it ironic that the astronauts alleged to have gallivanted all over the moon physically failed to detect such gases in the atmosphere. But a few years ago, scientists at Boston University claimed to have found proof of this atmosphere from ground-based observatory based on the image you see here. Now, I'll point out that these scientists are assuming the different colors of the apparent ring of atmosphere around the moon are proof of this bizarre atmosphere that was not detected by those who claim to have visited the place and taken samples, but I submit that the array of colors surrounding the moon in this image are most likely part of our very own upper atmosphere, and that the light from the moon is passing through these substances. Now, whether the gases are actually sodium and potassium will probably never be verified, especially if they're on the moon. But the point is even assuming these colorful images are part of the moon's atmosphere, this would debunk the claims of NASA that an observer on the moon would experience what's called 1/6 gravity based on the size of the moon alone, compared to that of the Earth in the heliocentric hypothesis. Let me explain what I mean. Okay, so it's assumed that by theoretical physicists that gravity is directly relative to the mass of an object, or better stated, by the masses of two objects relative to the distance between the two. Nowhere in reality can you actually demonstrate mass being attracted to mass by gravity. We can, of course, demonstrate mass being attracted or repelled from another mass where there are magnetic forces involved, but certainly not gravity. So based on their calculations, assuming that the Earth creates 1 g, or 1 gravitational unit, which is what we're all very much used to, then based on Einstein's theory of space-time and gravity, the moon should have 1/6 of a g, meaning a 150-pound man would weigh about 25 pounds on the moon. Now, this is all very clever and mathematically ingenious, assuming gravity exists. However, upon closer inspection of reality, the figures are preposterous, further proving that NASA faked all of the moon landings, and every space agency thereafter. Even granting them the figures, the 1/6 gravity figures, if you study the behavior of the bold-faced liars known as the Apollo astronauts as they hopped around the moon.
Whee! Boy, when you do this, then you go down slope. That first step is a long one. I'm having... This is the best way for me to travel, uphill or downhill. What's that? Like this? Two-legged hop? And on level ground I can skip. I don't like that loping thing. Oh, the loping's the only way to go.
Checkpoint.
See, when I'm on level ground I can skip. But this two-legged thing is great. Man, I can cover ground like a kangaroo.
It's obvious that they are not 25-pound men with the physique of a 150-pound man. In this clip, it seems, for one thing, the audio chatter coming from the bunny-hopping astronaut was pre-recorded, as during the entire sequence, his breathing does not appear to match that of someone hopping around, even if they weighed only 25 pounds, which he obviously does not. But in other words, a person hopping around like that would demonstrate stressed breathing, but the astronaut is cool and does not exhibit stressed breathing through the duration of that, and has a very polished sort of orative as he performs the cardiovascular exercise in an environment where he could, by the way, die at any moment, 250,000 miles from the nearest molecule of oxygen. When you play the clip at 2 times speed, this obviously is fiction created on a soundstage or perhaps somewhere in the desert, but certainly not on the moon. I would like to point out that the so-called astronauts in the LISS are allegedly experiencing 95% of the Earth's gravity, according to NASA themselves. You'll notice the ISS liars are totally weightless, and are not being pulled towards the center of the Earth with slightly less force than an observer on an airplane. And if anything is causing them to be weightless, it would be sort of a parabolic trajectory, which can be achieved from low altitudes, proving weightlessness is not exclusive to so-called orbit. In other words, you do not have to be in space to simulate a weightless astronaut in an aircraft. People will argue that this is because they're in orbit, and that causes them to experience weightlessness. But do we experience weightlessness on a regular airline flight? Really, what's the difference? The LISS is supposedly chugging along at a constant velocity, so the astronauts apparently don't move relative to the craft as you'd expect. You'd expect them to move towards the outside of the path of orbit, just according to how centrifugal forces work. But they don't move relative to the craft like you'd see on an airplane, and yet they're 100% weightless in 95% gravity, according to NASA. Now, does anyone else see a problem with this? Furthermore, the LISS supposedly travels around a constant curved path around the allegedly non-stationary Earth. Now, a curved path around a non-stationary object is not the same thing as a straight line path, meaning the astronauts not connected to the craft should be constantly drifting towards the outside edge of whatever the main curve of the situation is, and not velcroed to the constantly changing velocity of the craft due to the nature of how orbit works. Just consider how orbit works. If the ISS is 250 miles away, which is nothing in Earth terms, and the Earth is traveling towards it at 66,600 miles an hour, what is propelling it? You've also got gravity allegedly pulling the ISS towards the Earth. And the only thing it's got is its velocity, coming around the back of it after being slingshotted by gravity. So gravity's powerful enough to slingshot the ISS around the back, but it's not powerful enough to suck it towards the Earth that's racing towards it at 66,600 miles an hour. Yeah, the astronauts always stay pretty much stationary relative to the craft. You don't ever see them really drifting out of sync with the frame of reference with the craft, but anyway, if the astronauts on the ISS are essentially weightless as a result of 95% gravity, then the astronauts allegedly on the moon at 1/6 Earth's gravity should have been leaping entire buildings with a single bound at a mere 16% gravity, not apparently, using a pogo stick or possibly attached to a harness with wires somewhere in the rafters above the frame. But this gets even better. Most people believe it is the theory of gravity which keeps us stuck to the side of the theoretically spinning globe Earth, as well provides the necessary pulling down of all bodies towards the center of the Earth, up to and including the very sparse molecules of gases many miles above the face of the Earth. When you study atmospheric pressure, even at middle school levels, you'll realize that it is indeed the downward push of the Earth's atmosphere which provides the majority of the necessary force to render measurable weight on a scale. An object's apparent weight will slightly vary with barometric pressure and the height above sea level. Temperature will also fluctuate with air pressure and vice versa. And an object's weight on a scale will be affected by barometric pressure. Indeed, you will weigh slightly less at higher elevations due to decreased barometric pressure, and of course, water will boil at lower temperatures due to the same variable. This proven scientific fact is observable, repeatable, and accepted even by globists. Also, consider how barometric pressure affects pressurized objects as a weather balloon filled with helium. The helium trapped in the balloon will expand with altitude due to the outside pressure differentials proportionate with altitude. So, in other words, weather balloons burst when the outside pressure becomes inadequate to counterbalance the pressure within the balloon. And again, this is at very high levels. The relationship between barometric pressure and temperature and in relation to an object's weight are proven facts of life. And just similarly, a balloon full of gas or gases will expand with altitude due to the lack of barometric pressure.
All right, Julie, this is for you. Okay, here we go. Gus, that's a balloon. Okay, I'm gonna tie it. Maybe. Okay. Nice little knot there. Okay. It's got a little bit of air in there. Okay. And let's throw that down there. We take the lid here. Put the lid on there. And now we turn the pump on. There you go. Blowing up a balloon after we... Uh-oh. It's going to cover up the hole. There you go. Blowing up a balloon after we tied it. Imagine that.
This means the astronauts' highly pressurized suits technically should always explode when they're exposed to the vacuum of space. Technically, that's exactly what should happen.
Okay, so just looking at something that I thought was sort of funny, you can see this is history.nasa.gov/spacesuits.pdf, so this is coming from an official NASA source. This is the evolution of spacesuits. Apollo spacesuits were custom tailored. Each suit was basically a one-piece suit. Each was made to fit or custom tailored to each astronaut. Each Apollo mission required 15 suits. Shuttle spacesuits are now off the rack, so they do things a little differently now. But in terms of what I thought was so funny about this was the schematic of the spacesuits themselves, the extravehicular mobility unit, as it's called in technical terms. But you can see, and this is sort of a low-resolution image. Sorry about that. Just a couple of things that I thought were funny: the H2O tank, primary life support subsystem, secondary tanks, and you've got all of these pressurized, pressurized things with liquids, and then of course you've got the suit itself is pressurized to prevent the astronaut from exploding in the vacuum of space, of course, right, or experiencing major problems with pressure. Here's sort of a cross-section of the arm, and there's some questions and answers about spacesuits that I thought was sort of funny, and keeping these diagrams in mind. Let's see. When did you start making astronaut suits? Started in 1961. Prototypes in 64, and delivering suits for use by the Apollo astronauts in 66. So it took them 5 years to come up with what the Apollo astronauts had, and probably millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to come up with this sort of layered suit of fabrics and different sorts of materials. Here's what I thought was really hilarious. How thick is the spacesuit? Approximately 3/16 of an inch thick. 11 layers of material. 3/16 of an inch thick. So just to give you an idea, the thickness of this pretty small fire extinguisher is 1.2 millimeters thick, but of course it's made out of a structural metal, not 11 layers of fabrics.
This should be true regardless of how slowly they adjust the interior pressure of their environment prior to the spacewalk or moon landing. Besides that, on the light side of the moon, it is allegedly 250 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning the surface of the moon should be like a frying pan on low heat. If we assume gravity is a real thing, which it isn't, then an astronaut on the moon wouldn't weigh 1/6 of his Earth weight, but he would weigh much, much less due to the purported lack of atmosphere on the moon. Remember, the moon's atmosphere would be considered a very good vacuum on Earth. On Earth, at sea level, or sea curve, if you assume the Earth is a globe, which it isn't, but at sea level, there's about 14 pounds of pressure per square inch exerted onto every object. Any object also displaces a small amount of atmosphere, and much like a ship constructed out of multiple tons of steel can float on water. This is resulting of the buoyant force, which can be manipulated within a liquid or gas medium. I would mention that the reason why we don't feel this extremely high amount of barometric pressure, 14 pounds per square inch at sea level, or maybe closer to 15, but the reason we don't feel it is because we are pressure neutral. Anyway, so we have two variables which can profoundly alter an object's weight on a scale. One would be theoretical gravity, and the other would be real-life barometric pressure, or the downward push of the air minus the object's displacement of air or buoyancy. Depending on the density of the air and the altitude of the object, the surface area relative to overall mass of the object, and other factors, this is how you can sort of manipulate the laws of density and buoyancy. Any downward tendency of dense objects in a vacuum on Earth, for example, could be related to considering density as a frequency of matter as opposed to a more tightly packed with atoms. We assume that since a 1-inch cube of aluminum weighs less than a 1-inch cube of cast iron, there must be more stuff inside the iron cube. And that may be true, but what if the stuff inside each cube is merely resonating at different frequencies of density, and their weight is not related to how tightly packed the theoretical atoms are? Anyway, since the atmosphere of the moon essentially doesn't exist, and is considered a good vacuum in Earth terms, then the astronauts on the moon, had they actually gone to the moon, as if such a thing is possible, which it isn't, but if they went, they should have weighed a sparse few pounds due to the lack of barometric pressure, and should have really been capable of flying like Superman, but instead they behave as if they're bouncing around on Earth with atmosphere. It really appears, to me at least, that in many cases of the so-called moonwalks, that they were attached to harnesses, and the video is played back at slower speeds to trick people. And in terms of spacewalks, those appear to be done underwater in pools and played back at higher speeds to trick people. A single, quick leap on the moon should have sent the astronauts flying a significant vertical distance, as, again, the barometric pressure there essentially doesn't exist. Plus, they would experience 1/6 of a theoretical unit of Earth gravity, much less gravity than the so-called astronauts on the ISS, which again, the ISS astronauts claims that they are in 95% gravity, whereas the moon would be 16% gravity. Proving either way that NASA is faking everything. People will argue that while in orbit, it's their speed that makes them weightless, but I would argue, again, that we can do the same thing while not in orbit, so such a thing is not exclusive to orbit. Then I would beg the question as to how the ISS manages to repel itself away from the Earth when it's passing in front of the Earth's alleged orbital path. Globers argue, again, it's the magic of gravity and the perfectly synchronized Earth atmosphere that allows for helicopters or dragonflies to hover perfectly still and allows east-to-west flights to be identical in duration to west-to-east flights on a spinning sphere. In truth, all of these observations are proof of a stationary Earth, and these thoughtless pro-globe arguments make no sense, since a westbound plane is traveling towards the destination, which is racing towards the nose of the plane, while an eastbound plane is traveling in a direction where the destination is racing away from the nose of the plane. However, these illogical pro-globe arguments are obviously null and void on the surface of the theoretically spherical moon, which generates far less hypothetical gravity and is essentially in vacuo, lacking all of the barometric pressure that exists on Earth, meaning the 1/6 weight of astronauts on the moon is a poorly thought out figure, which proves that NASA is lying yet again, since their alleged moon experiments purport the relative weight of the object on the moon compared to the Earth to be in line with the theory of gravity, or 1/6 the weight on Earth, which couldn't possibly be. So I suppose everyone involved with scripting the Apollo lies never studied barometric pressure and how that affects objects' weight on a scale here on Earth, as if you removed all of the atmosphere from the Earth, you would experience tons of decreased air pressure pushing down and in upon you at all directions. Now, due to this extremely dangerous environment, again, the pressurized suits of the astronauts should have exploded were they not made of structural steel, as opposed to the rubbery, bubbly stuff that they claim to use in space. It's often argued that in order for density and buoyancy to work, you must have some sort of frame of reference, or in order for down to be down, in order for buoyancy to work, you have to have a tendency for objects to find their way down for some reason, therefore gravity exists. Now, it's true that there must be an overall downward tendency of all dense objects in order for the laws of density and buoyancy to work. For example, a multi-ton steel ship floats on water because the surface area relative to the overall mass provides sufficient buoyant force. The bottom of the ship presses down on the water, and the water is displaced and therefore pushes back up towards the surface area of the ship. Now, the iron ship is not less dense than the water beneath it, but instead the principle of buoyancy allows the ship to float on top of the water due to this dynamic tension, and this all relies on the water pushing back up on the surface area, the bottom surface area of the ship. This is not because of gravity, but because the water is at equilibrium with the atmosphere above it, or the atmosphere above it, rather. The water is more dense than the air pushing down upon it, with, again, 14 pounds of pressure per square inch. If you were to lower the barometric pressure a little, sea levels would raise. If you were to lower the barometric pressure enough, the water would simply boil away into a gas. So it is this dynamic tension between the atmosphere pushing down upon the water with 14 pounds per square inch upon the face of the water, which is merely a more dense liquid than the surrounding atmosphere, and this creates all of the conditions necessary to support the laws of density and buoyancy without gravity. I find it a huge leap of logic to assume that theoretical gravity is proven as a warping of space and time by the spherical Earth, because you must have a downward force to produce buoyancy. I find it far more likely that the natural balance of the static plane Earth dictates the necessary conditions for the laws of density and buoyancy to work without gravity. The point is, we can throw the theory of gravity right out the window immediately, as gravity is only necessary if you consider the world as a spinning sphere, and so there must be some other explanation for relatively dense objects to naturally find equilibrium according to its density. Heavier objects tend towards the ground, while less dense objects or gases like helium race up towards their point of equilibrium. If you consider different density objects or gases are fundamentally operating at different vibrational frequencies, such a theory is just as plausible or practical for argument's sake compared to the theory of gravity, which has been debunked and is unnecessary. You cannot debunk the laws of density and buoyancy because they are demonstrable and repeatable. One of the main proofs that gravity doesn't work on a local, human level is the fact that there is not an enormous disparity between the weight of a given object at the North Pole compared to the equator. The reason being, an object, say a ton of coffee, is experiencing the exact same amount of theoretical gravity at both locations, again, the equator or the North Pole. The difference is a ton of coffee at the North Pole would be parallel with and on top of the vertical axis of rotation, spinning half the speed as the hour hand on a clock. Contrarily, at the equator, the ton of coffee would be spinning over 1,000 miles per hour east, perpendicular to the axis of rotation nearly 4,000 miles underfoot, and therefore vertically dropping around that eastward curve at over 130 miles per hour, generating a great deal of centrifugal force. Many people who have not thought this through and argue that gravity has nothing to do with the spin of the Earth, but instead is strictly related to the mass of the Earth. This may be true, but that proves my point. Gravity allegedly treats hypothetically spherical Earth the same at all points on the surface, more or less. The problem is you must consider the amount of centrifugal forces exerted at the equator compared to that at the North Pole. At the equator, gravity would necessarily be a centripetal force powerful enough to negate your constant vertical drop over the equator at over 130 miles an hour, assuming you're zipping around the curve of the Earth at over 1,000 miles an hour. Physicists love to argue that your spin around the Earth isn't noticeable because it's a constant frame of reference or maintaining of your angular momentum. However, this simply cannot be possible in the heliocentric model. This is getting off the main point a bit, but an observer should experience an apparent, 133,200 mile per hour acceleration from dusk till dawn, where the Earth beneath their feet should be racing at 66,600 miles per hour up towards their feet at dawn, and about 12 hours later it should be racing down away from their feet at 66,600 miles an hour. A full spectrum range of over 130,000 miles per hour in acceleration from one extreme velocity to the exact opposite in just 12 hours, based on the alleged spin and orbital motion of the Earth. Yet this is defined as a fixed linear frame of reference, which is a gross oversight and misunderstanding of physical science. But back to the point at hand, a ton of coffee at the North Pole would experience essentially zero outward thrust or centrifugal force due to the proximity of the axis and subsequent lack of rotational velocity. Contrarily, the same ton of coffee at the equator should experience essentially an infinite increase in outward centrifugal thrust compared to the North Pole, and therefore a ton of coffee should weigh far less at the equator than it does at the North Pole. In truth, a ton of coffee weighs about the same but slightly less at the equator compared to the North Pole. However, this minor discrepancy in weight directly correlates to the barometric pressure at these two locations. Barometric pressure is highest in the north or central area of the flat Earth, while barometric pressure diminishes gradually as you approach the equator. This means that the minor difference in weight between objects at the North Pole versus at the equator are easily accounted for by the discrepancy in barometric pressure. However, the current explanation does not account for the necessary disparity in centrifugal forces, which would be extremely apparent, infinitely apparent, comparing the North Pole to the equator. Many often argue that the rotations per minute isn't high enough to, on the hypothetically spinning spheroidal Earth to generate any centrifugal forces. However, whomever makes this claim has not studied physics or thought this through to any real extent. If the same amount of gravity applied to an observer at the equator, allowing him to walk around unimpeded, stuck to the side of a spinning sphere at some 1,000 miles per hour, vertically dropping around that curve at 135 miles an hour, if that amount of downward pressure, or gravity, which would be necessarily applied to the same observer at the North Pole, he would weigh hundreds of thousands of times more than he did at the equator, not because of an increase in gravity, but because of a decrease in centrifugal force. The alleged centrifugal force, obviously at the equator, would not exist at the North Pole, and the massively powerful gravitational pull would render an observer at the North Pole as a pancake. There are long drawn-out equations to explain this, to perpetuate the globe Earth model, but again, they are merely aligned or consistent with the changes in barometric pressure, comparing the North Pole to the southern areas, or to the equator, for that matter. The facts that we're discussing are really obvious to an intelligent person with an open mind, and yet mathematicians and academians who wish to believe the world is a spinning spheroid in the vacuum of space will regurgitate ridiculous mathematical formula to, try and prove how this all works.
It's on a spinning sphere in the vacuum of space.
If you're standing upon the equator of a spinning sphere, Earth, your body's inertia would be compelled to travel at a tangent to the curve of the Earth in direct proportion with the speed of the spin and the radius of curvature. Gravity is supposedly applying downward or inward pulling towards the center of the Earth beneath your feet to prevent your body from following that tangent line, which might not be too dramatic in Earth terms, but it would certainly be dramatic in human terms. Traveling 1,000 miles per hour east while vertically falling 135 miles per hour. If it were a roller coaster, it would literally scramble your internal organs and rip the flesh from your bones. But it isn't a roller coaster, is it? Contrarily, at the North Pole of the theoretically spinning spheroid, an observer would be as stationary as the hour hand on a 24-hour clock. Not spinning at all, not racing around any curve, not dropping along any inverse square parabola, yet the same gripping and powerful pull of gravity at the equator must be applied to the observer here. Simple logic dictates that the amount of force needed to pin an equatorial observer to the face of the Earth would be so violent and tremendously overwhelming at the North Pole, as there is no opposing centrifugal force to negate the centripetal forces necessarily exerted onto all points of the sphere evenly, regardless of how fast the sphere is spinning at a given location. So in other words, gravity does not pick and choose where it pushes down on centrifugal forces relative to your distance from the axis. Taking this point just a step further, an object should experience a decrease in weight as mass is increased, at least anywhere near the equator. This is due to the centrifugal forces again we should expect at the equator. If you grab two 1-pound dumbbells and outstretch your arms to your sides, begin spinning, you'll notice outward thrust or centrifugal forces exerted on your arms. Now, if you do the exact same thing at the exact same speed with a pair of 10-pound dumbbells, then you will experience greater outward thrust or greater centrifugal force. So if you transfer this same very simple principle to the spherical spinning Earth, objects near the equator should become lighter and lighter on a scale as mass is added to the object. This all makes perfect sense when you realize the Earth isn't spinning on an axis. Therefore, an object's weight will always increase when the mass is increased, even at the equator. Another interesting proof of the world's lack of axial rotation involves firing projectiles, or specifically cannons, or really any projectile, perfectly vertically.
Oh, I see that one. I thought that one's coming straight down. No, a little over this way. Oh! That was awesome.
Well, we've come here to find out if you fire a bullet straight up into the air, will it come straight back down? And if it doesn't, how far off does it land from where you fired it, and how easy is it to find, and how easy is it to adjust a rig so that the bullet is remotely findable?
For the test, they only used a paintball gun secured to the rig and lined up with an inclinometer.
That's beautiful. I'm just going to do a wind speed reading here. So the wind is 4 miles per hour out of south-southeast.
If there was a spanner in the works, it was always going to be the wind.
Ready when you are.
Time to put the rig through its paces.
3, 2, 1.
Shit.
Be quiet. Ah! Exactly where we thought it'd be.
The plan was to adjust the rig and see if they could wind in the paintballs even closer.
Okay, I'm gonna crank it up a little, just a little bit, and we'll see if we can draw it in.
Great. Oh, right there.
Okay, so these results are really no surprise to me. The same sort of experiment was described in Zetetic Astronomy, and the fact that you can fire projectiles perfectly vertically into the air and they come back down very close to the spot where they're fired, and on certain conditions during very still days in Zetetic, it was documented that they would the projectile would land directly back into the barrel of the cannon that fired it. And the reason that this is proof of a stationary Earth is due to some very fundamental laws of physics involving rotating bodies as a fixed frame of reference versus linear bodies as a fixed frame of reference. Now, granted, if you were to fire a projectile from a linear frame of reference, so, going 50 miles an hour in an enclosed train down a track perfectly straight, and the train was tall enough to house the entire experiment, then that would make some sense. The projectile would retain its angular momentum. However, a rotating body, such as the Earth, is not a linear frame of reference. And so what you should expect would be in line with the known laws of physics involving rotating bodies as a fixed frame of reference. And so we'll get into this a little bit more detail, and I'll try to draw up some diagrams to show you what I mean, but this here is very good proof that the Earth is stationary.
So we must explain the importance of differentiating between an object fixed to a rotating body being gently released from its frame of reference, compared to an object violently shot away from its rotating frame of reference, as there should be a major difference in behavior between the two. To illustrate this point and how it relates to undeniable proof that the world is actually stationary, we'll imagine a carousel at the fair, the outside edge of which represents the face of the Earth at the equator. If you're riding along the carousel and simply drop a ball bearing off the outside edge of the ride, the ball bearing will maintain its angular momentum on its way down to the ground, but not continue turning around the axis. So it would continue traveling along with you in your general direction of travel, 90 degrees to the axis, but it will not continue spinning around the central axis with you. Even if you could somehow remove or prevent the ball bearing from falling to the ground once released, it would simply travel at a perfect right angle to the center of the axis and would not continue spinning around the central axis as it did when grasped in your hand. Now, this is what is referred to maintaining angular momentum, but not maintaining a rotational frame of reference, which is only possible if something is held fast to that rotating frame of reference. Now, on the other hand, assuming you still have your magic ball bearing that never falls to the ground, if you were to abruptly accelerate it or throw the ball directly out and away from the central axis of rotation of the spinning carousel, the ball would not follow the same path as in the previous thought experiment, but would instead travel in a direction away from the central axis of rotation, and depending on the carousel's rate of spin relative to the force involved with the abrupt outward toss, the ball may retain some amount of its original angular momentum in accordance with its original direction of travel around the central axis, but in general terms, the ball's path would be away from the central axis. Again, in this case, the ball would certainly not continue spinning around the carousel as it did when it was firmly in your hand, and any angular momentum lent to the object by the spinning carousel would be minimal or even negated by a forceful outward push of the object being released from the rotating carousel.
Now, going out on a limb here, let's just say that there's a force that allows that same ball to fall back towards the center of the carousel. It certainly wouldn't land anywhere near the point where it was thrown from, obviously shown here. Obviously none of this is to scale, but it goes to show some basic premises of how a rotational frame of reference and projectiles released from such a rotational frame of reference differ from that of a linear sort of frame of reference. It's two totally different things.
The basic premises involved with the ball bearing and the carousel experiment can be applied to the world itself on a larger level, but it's the same principles, assuming the outer edge of the carousel equates to the face of the Earth at the equator, and the ball bearings represent anything that can be propelled or accelerated out and away from the center of axis, with varying degrees of force compelling the object away from the spinning Earth. So, like anything from airline flights to helicopters, helium balloons, birds, dragonflies, or even cannonballs, it becomes obvious to any sharp and honest thinker that the Earth couldn't possibly be spinning when you apply physical laws to test the premise that the Earth is spinning upon an axis. For example, were the Earth indeed spinning over 1,000 miles an hour near the equator, if you were to fire a cannonball perfectly vertical on a still day, this would be equivalent to tossing the ball bearing away from the central axis of the carousel. Just as the observer on the carousel continued spinning around while the ball bearing flew off in a direction away from the central axis, instantly losing its circular path around the central axis, you would expect, were the Earth indeed a spinning sphere, that when firing a cannonball vertically into the air, the Earth beneath should continue spinning on its constant circular path around the central axis at over 1,000 miles an hour, and dropping vertically about 135 miles an hour along that curve, compared to a tangent line from the base point. Yet the cannonball invariably lands near the cannon and often lands back into the barrel of the cannon that fired it. Now, this defies all explanation in the heliocentric model, and yet pro-globers will either claim such experiments don't exist, or claim that such an occurrence would indeed transpire were the Earth a spinning sphere, which is not true. When they see for themselves that such physical tests always conclusively align with a stationary Earth, they begin inventing illogical apologetics to support their belief system. For example, they'll state that the atmosphere is always velcroed to the surface of the Earth, and so it is the atmosphere which allows for the cannonball to defy the laws of physics in order to conform with their belief system. This argument is completely ridiculous, of course, as you simply cannot break the laws of basic physics to suit your belief system. We need to see such evidence for what it is, and realize that the Earth is proven to be stationary by such simple experiments. The same sort of concept, the carousel and the ball bearing, can be applied to airline flights, or for even more solid proof that the world is 100% stationary, unlike a mere ball bearing, which can only be imagined not to fall to the ground. An airplane can actually travel through the air great distances without falling, which gives us an extremely valuable tool, which none of the grandfathers of physics and heliocentrism had access to. If the Earth was actually a constantly, rapidly spinning sphere, flight in an aircraft would be a totally different experience, with a variety of necessary physical problems which must have been solved that don't exist. Hence proving this conclusively, beginning with the first airline flights in the early 1900s. I mean, it would be abundantly clear if the face of the world and all connected airport runways were spinning at immense varying speeds depending on latitude, and it would be extremely difficult to land a plane or merely match an aircraft's velocity to that of the ground below after a flight. One basic law of physics is that an object in motion will tend to maintain its velocity unless enacted upon by some other force. If you consider the airplane stationary relative to the Earth prior to takeoff, when the tires leave the ground and the plane begins to accelerate in really any direction, it would no longer be fixed to the spinning globe, much like the carousel and ball bearing thought experiment, and the plane would be acting as an independent body in motion with several jet engines attached, providing tremendous continual force. If a plane accelerates west, then it's theoretically traveling in the opposite direction as the alleged spin of the Earth. Since the plane is traveling towards destinations which are also racing towards the plane, powered by its own propulsion, the plane's apparent speed would be the velocity of the spin added to the velocity of the plane. So a westbound flight should average about 1,500 miles an hour, and they'd have one hell of a headwind due to the atmosphere being allegedly fixed to the velocity of the face of the Earth. On the other hand, if the plane accelerates east, it would be racing against any destination in front of it, as the eastbound plane begins to ascend or bank, but slowly but surely the 1,000-mile-per-hour ground below and the destinations attached would begin to overtake the eastward velocity of the plane, and the race would begin between the plane and the destination. Assuming an average passenger jet goes about 500 miles an hour and the Earth spins over 1,000 miles an hour near the equator, at some point the destination in front of the eastbound plane would begin to get further and further away, and indeed the destination, if far enough from the start point, would begin to accelerate away from the nose of the plane at an apparent rate of about 500 miles an hour. And that plane would have one heck of a tailwind. Now, the fact that a 2,500-mile flight from New York to LA is often identical in duration to its return flight is yet another concrete, irrefutable piece of physical evidence that the world isn't spinning. These two flights should be so wildly different in duration on a spinning sphere. Really, eastbound flight attempts would be futile, and yet often they're identical in duration. Globe Earth proponents argue that if you flip a coin while driving down the road in a car, the coin doesn't shoot back towards the rear of the car. This is a poor analogy, as a jetliner has massive constant propulsion and can remain airborne for hours, while a tossed coin simply does not have such propulsion. If you could possibly connect the dots between the simple laws of physics described with the merry-go-round or carousel, and apply that objectively to the airline flight's conundrum, you will realize that simple physical laws dictate such identical duration in flights would be impossible on a spinning globe Earth. Regardless of the acrobatic maneuvering or acceleration of an airplane through the sky, not connected to the ground by anything, flying under its own propulsion, the world beneath always remains as stationary beneath the plane, and indeed pilots have never made corrections or navigational calculations for Earth spin, or Earth curvature for that matter. One of the biggest challenges of aviation should have involved the spin of the Earth, yet such a thing has never arisen as an issue to pilots, proving conclusively that all airlines fly above a stationary ground below. Earth spin is such an important element of the heliocentric model, which can be so easily debunked. Physics is indeed the study of objects in motion, so a spinning spherical Earth should be a breeze to prove physically, especially with the modern technology of airplanes and computer assistants, just to name two. It's really just never occurred to most people, including most pilots, that if the world was actually a spinning sphere, taking off and landing a plane would be far more dangerous, and I'll even say impossible in terms of landing, unless all runways were oriented east to west, and major calculations were performed to ensure that the plane was aligned to the frame of reference with the ground beneath. This is all due to proven physical laws that would govern all independent free-flying craft above the hypothetically spinning sphere Earth. It's difficult for people to realize this as proof because the truth is unfortunately incompatible with the modern accepted worldview. Physical evidence that contradicts one's belief system will be ignored by the conscious mind oftentimes as a sort of self-defense mechanism in order to preserve one's belief or understanding, which builds our paradigm and our behavior in many ways. Ultimately, people will ignore facts contrary to their belief system in order to maintain their perceived control of their life. The fact is, many pilots are waking up to the flat Earth for one reason, or one reason alone, because the Earth is a stationary plane, and persistent people are challenging them to observe their experiences objectively, casting aside the assumption that the Earth is a spinning sphere just for argument's sake. And I believe honest pilots are waking up to this fact very quickly because anyone accustomed to flying will realize how obvious it is that the world beneath their plane has always been stationary, regardless of any direction they travel, regardless of altitude and combinations of acceleration, directional changes, which would necessarily throw their vessel out of whack with the frame of reference of the hypothetically spinning ground beneath. And of course, the fact that the horizon level never drops and always remains aligned with our eye regardless of altitude, and that again proves the ground beneath doesn't curve down in all directions exponentially. But besides eyesight, since eyesight can be misleading, we also have gyroscopic evidence proving that airline flights indeed fly level. They're not flying around a curve, otherwise their artificial horizon gyros would need to be reset very, very often, and yet they are not. They maintain their rigidity in space, which is always aligned to the horizon, because the Earth is flat. Flat Earth isn't a conspiracy theory. It's not just a claim made by ignorant shills and morons. The simple truth is, the world is indeed stationary, and all airplanes move relative to the stationary Earth beneath them. There has never been one single documented case of airplane accidents due to
Pilot failed to recalibrate their X, Y, and Z axis and velocities to that of the ground below, and the plane crashed upon impact as a result of the most dangerous element of aviation on the spinning sphere Earth, that is, of course, landing a free-flying jet airplane on the face of a spinning sphere.
The reason you've never heard such a thing is because pilots do not pay the least regard to the alleged spin or speed of the ground beneath them relative to latitude and relative to their starting point, and pilots never account for the supersonic spin of the Earth at the equator. They don't fear such a dangerous crash landing on a north to south runway because the Earth itself is simply stationary. It's in no motion whatsoever, and the destinations and runways are not constantly zipping east. The reason why pilots don't wake up to this spontaneously, I believe, is because they, like everyone else, have no reason whatsoever to doubt or question the idea that the Earth is a spinning sphere. The proofs involved with this topic aren't the problem. It's merely people's willingness or motivation or just realization to rationally scrutinize what they believe about physical reality. Perception is indeed reality. And I've always thought that cliche as sort of overzealous, but I've recently concluded that perception, or constructs which we believe alter our perception, are extremely powerful elements of mind control. They really, really are, and it can't be overstated. None of the claims, assertions, and yes, forgeries coming from the totally gullible mathematicians and elite lie masters at NASA ever appeared to be questioned, scrutinized, or even studied objectively. I would also point out that rocket propulsion could not theoretically work in the non-existing vacuum of space. Rockets work fine near the ground on Earth, where the atmosphere is a relatively dense sort of gas, compared to the upper layers of gases overhead, which gradually diminish in density and proportionally with altitude.
Just as a quick side note, the video you're watching of this rocket launch was from June 11th, 2016. This was the largest rocket ever launched successfully with the top secret NROL-37 payload for the United States. The Delta IV Heavy launched from Space Launch Complex 37B at 17:51 hours, so that's 5:51 p.m. UTC, June 11th, 2016. This was the 32nd Delta IV launch and the 9th Delta IV Heavy launch. So I just wanted to point out that as this thing gets to a certain point in its trajectory, you can clearly tell that it's going down, back down towards the ground and not out into space. So just wanted to point that out quickly.
Anyway, the thicker atmosphere near the ground provides the necessary back pressure, which the supersonic gases ejected from the nozzle of the rocket push against to provide propulsion. If you remove all the atmosphere from the equation, as it's claimed to be in the vacuum of space, the barometric pressure would be zero. Ergo, the resultant propelling force from the gases ejected from the rocket engine would also be zero. Even if rocket propulsion worked in a vacuum, the aerodynamics of a rocket would be rendered useless, and the lack of atmosphere would render any projectile in space as unsteerable, even if jets could work in space, which they can't. As an analogy, imagine you're rowing a canoe down a river. Your oar pushes against the water, and the water pushes back, resulting in propulsion opposite the direction of the path of the oar. Now, if you remove the water from the equation, how fast do you predict the canoe would accelerate per stroke comparatively? Since there's not an adequate medium to provide sufficient resistance or back pressure to propel the canoe, an oar will be useless no matter how hard or fast you may labor to row through thin air. This is, of course, a simplification of the exact same principle that renders rocket propulsion impotent in a vacuum. NASA claims to use rockets and small jets to propel and steer their billion-dollar Lie-mobiles. Their billion-dollar spacecraft. Which are akin to claiming that large yachts can float on thin air and happy thoughts, or that airplanes could fly in a vacuum, just as 100-ton ships made of steel rely on a certain surface area relative to overall mass of the ship, and of course water pressure to float, that could float without the water, according to NASA. Similarly, airplanes rely on barometric pressure to fly, as the wings of the planes are designed to create pressure differentials above and below the wing, creating lift. Were you to remove the medium of the atmosphere, the airplane would not be able to remain flying or buoyant. In the same manner, rocket engines rely on the atmosphere to provide the necessary conditions for propulsion, as well as guidance. The point is, space travel is impossible. Even so-called low Earth orbit is impossible due to the alleged velocities involved in the theory of gravity, and I should say the alleged velocities involved with the planet and the theory of gravity, not to mention the pressure differentials between the capsule or space suits versus the vacuum of space, and of course temperature variance fluctuating many hundreds of degrees from day to night, theoretically. I suppose I should address these one at a time because these are all sort of important points. So again, we'll go over low Earth orbit, pressurized suits in space, and temperature variance on spacecraft or the lunar surface. Low Earth orbit, or LEO. The concept of LEO is theoretically impossible given the nature of the heliocentric model and the extreme speeds involved, as well as the alleged pull of gravity. The Lie-SS, for example, supposedly orbits the hypothetically spherical Earth once every 90 minutes or so, at a supposed altitude of about 250 miles. Whenever this concept is presented to us, the distance to the Earth is essentially static relative to the ISS at all times, so it more or less maintains a constant 250-mile altitude, or whatever they claim it is. Now, in other words, the ISS is traveling through space at the perfect trajectory and velocity to remain at a consistent altitude of exactly 250 miles or whatever. The reason this is so ridiculous in the heliocentric model is because the ISS supposedly uses the Earth's gravity to slingshot itself around the backside of the path of the Earth as it orbits the Sun. Now, I must say this is quite a centripetal force exerted by gravity onto the ISS to prevent the craft from zipping off into space in the opposite direction as the path of the Earth. Gravity must be extremely powerful to provide a force contrary to the momentum of the ISS going round the back of the Earth's path in the opposite direction and subsequently accelerate the ISS to speeds many times faster than that of the Earth itself to come around the front of it. Now, this is all a very impressive amount of acceleration due to gravitational pull indeed. The problem I have is that since the ISS is only 250 miles away, allegedly, during the point of its alleged orbit around the back of the planet Earth, the Earth's so-called gravitational field is sufficient to pull the tin can back into its curved orbit 250 miles above the surface and accelerate the craft well out in front of the Earth's path. However, where is that extremely powerful gravity at the point where the ISS is directly in line with the path of the Earth, only 250 miles away? If gravity was indeed powerful enough to whip the craft round the backside of the Earth's orbital path, then where exactly is this impressively powerful force when the ISS is directly in front of the Earth's path, a mere 250 miles away, from a giant planet-sized obstacle racing towards the ISS at 66,600 miles an hour, plus the extremely powerful force of gravity supposedly pulling the craft towards the center of the Earth at all times? If you map this situation out and think about what is allegedly occurring, logically, some force would necessarily be repelling the ISS away from the face of the Earth during the periods where the alleged path of the ISS places it in a position in alignment with the Earth's velocity, so in front of the Earth. The theory of low Earth orbit works very well if you consider the spherical Earth as stationary or as a fixed frame of reference. However, this simply cannot be the case when the Earth is traveling allegedly along a curved path around the Sun at 66,600 miles an hour, and the ISS is allegedly orbiting the Earth once every 90 minutes, a mere 250 miles above the face of the Earth. The bottom line is, no matter how much propaganda NASA has implanted into our subconscious to lead us to believe the ISS is orbiting a spherical Earth, such a thing is physically impossible in reality, and in fact the Earth should crash into the ISS in less than a microsecond every time the ISS is in front of the 25,000 mile circumference Earth's hypothetical path around the Sun. Again, to drive the point home, if gravity is sufficient to prevent the ISS from racing off into space opposite the path of the Earth, traveling 66,600 miles an hour, and slingshot the ISS round the backside of the Earth, providing it enough acceleration to position the ISS in front of the Earth while maintaining a constant speed and altitude the entire time, then what force is allowing the ISS to pass in front of the Earth's path with such powerful gravity pulling the ISS towards the center of the Earth's mass simultaneously, while the Earth, allegedly races towards the ISS at 66,600 miles an hour? People have a picture in their mind of a stationary spinning sphere Earth with satellites like the ISS going around it in, perfect circles or ellipses. Without, any compensation for the immense changes in speed, the Earth is apparently traveling from one moment relative to the next, and the only way that you can theoretically accomplish low Earth orbit, considering the laws of gravity, inertia, and the conservation of momentum, is if the Earth is totally stationary. When you add the incredible alleged speed of the Earth around the Sun into this equation, low Earth orbit becomes a physical impossibility. Then I would add that even something as close as the Moon would be in big trouble of getting smashed into the Earth due to this same principle. The moon is essentially a natural satellite body doing exactly the same thing, essentially upon the same plane as the path of orbit as the Earth, and so gravity must be repelling the moon away from the path of the Earth sometimes, and other times gravity must be, slingshotting the moon around the back of the path of the Earth and accelerating it many times faster than the Earth. So the whole thing is ridiculous. It's physically orbit is a physically impossible scenario that's only sort of dreamed up to lend credence to the heliocentric model, but that's all that it is. Now, since the heliocentric model demands a totally non-stationary Earth and other planets or the wandering stars, and the FE model jives with a stationary Earth, which model will you choose to accept, or at least to consider, in light of this evidence? The second thing was pressurized suits in space. One of the most obvious forgeries to me in the space program is the famous pressurized spacesuit. The pressurized suits NASA uses underwater for their training exercises are the same pressurized suits they wear on their alleged spacewalks.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this installment of The Globe is Dead, so until next time, y'all take it easy, spread the word, spread the world, and peace. We'll pick up where we left off in part 3. Cheers.